The Civil Rights Movement was very important to the history of the U.S. During this time, people were judged by the color of their skin. A policy was put in place during the Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 stated that whites and blacks were separate but equal. However, that wasn't always the case. Blacks had separate diners, churches, schools, and even bathrooms and water fountains of lesser value than the whites. While many blacks were unhappy, they were often afraid to stand up for themselves. However, thanks to Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and other people like them, the Civil Rights Movement took off. Today we will be discussing the Civil Rights Movement with people who lived during this segregated time. You were in high schoolish college during this time, so what was it like being in an all-white school?
I think most of us didn't have the full experience of really what the civil rights movement was. We heard about it on the news at night. Mm-hmm. We read about it in newspapers, but unless you experience it, it's always somewhere else.
I was in the 60s going to elementary and middle school, so I was a kid, and I grew up with this happening all the time. First of all, I was really crazy about watching the news for some reason. Even though I was a child, I would wait for the news to come on, and so I always knew about it, and my parents were good about explaining it.
Well, if I remember right, it was pretty well in college, and I think I was about 21 probably. Just seeing it on TV, in those days, maybe even the radio a little bit.
Why is this happening? Because we had never been exposed. It was very seldom that we ever saw a minority, an African American or so, and we didn't have any in our school, and so it was always something that you thought that happened in big cities or in the South.
We didn't have riots or anything, but we had a quiet sort of prejudice because we had, as I was telling you, we had one black family in town, and they were a well-heeled family. They were rich by most standards, educated, really nice people, but they had two children that were around my age in school, and that's where you saw it happen. Just little things. My mother had a run-in with a student because she refused to sit by one of the black students because in lunch they had to sit in order, and she wouldn't sit by her. And she made a racial remark, and my mother made her, and it caused a big stink. They couldn't date anyone. Things were said about them that, weren't true. People wanted to be their friends, but they didn't want to be their real friends. Mm-hmm. And I ran into it I once went out after a dance with the boy who was about my age, and we just went out to have pop after the dance at the cafe, and somebody called my mother.
It's kind of funny because when I went there, it was all white. And then a few, my friends actually, they turned out to be wrestlers, were black, and they got some spotlights, and then we had a black homecoming queen, which got advertisement throughout across, and there became more. There was, when I graduated 4 years later, there was probably 10% black.
I remember a number of times, like on the 5:30 news at night, ABC, NBC newscasts at night, you would see film of a march that took place in a town in Chicago, or there were some that took place in Waterloo or so in Iowa, in which African Americans would be marching for rights where they felt they had been discriminated against, whether it was in a business, whether it was at the concept of getting the right to register to vote. And in some cases they would be met with opposition, not even being able to get into the office because it would be blocked by people, blocked by policemen. Marches would be, people would march in the fact of they would try to be nonviolent, yet they would be met with police and hecklers on the side calling them names or throwing stuff at them, or dogs would be attacking them.
Well, as far as remembering the really specific things, of course you remember news coverage of riots and things like that. We didn't see as much violence, but I grew up in South Dakota, and where really the American Indians were the ones people were concerned about.
In campus, there were some people that did certain protesting and sitting on the steps of places, but I was paying for an education, so I pretty well stepped on them when I went to my classes.
Dr. King was, I thought in some cases, he's not very smart, because part of the thing, he believed in the nonviolent idea, and you saw him being physically assaulted. You saw him being hauled off to jail and those type of things. And those type of things, you wonder, why don't you react to them? Why don't you say, get your hands off me, don't touch me, wait a minute. And he was just very nonviolent. He allowed those things to happen because he believed strongly that if he reacted to it, he was just giving them fuel to react even harsher toward him.
One thing that left the biggest impact on me was Martin Luther King Jr. I really idolized him a lot, and especially when he was assassinated, I was very affected by it, quite upset, because I really believed in what he was doing, and I understood the nonviolent thing, and I loved his speeches, and so I watched him a lot, and so that affected me.
When he led and gave his speech, that's about all. Did I study him? And probably back then, but I'd forgotten it. You know, maybe I probably even did a paper on him, but when you're talking 50 years ago, it's hard to remember.
I think probably the biggest song is "We Shall Overcome." That, you know, "We Shall Overcome" very simply was a song that the African Americans used, because that's basically what the civil rights was the African American population, in that they shall overcome what has been their lot, that they will get better. And that this song represented the belief that tomorrow is going to be better than what it is today. There was a lot of music also that they used at this time that dealt with the Christian concept of go tell it on the mountain, and so on. And again, it was that type of belief that kept them motivated, that it was the Lord who was going to help them overcome and give them better, so what they have tomorrow than what they have today.
Well, everybody would sing, you know, "We Shall Overcome," which was a really big civil rights song. And we sang it for everything. And we sang it in Girl Scouts. We sang it in Sunday school. And it became quite a popular anthem. Well, it's, you know, "We Shall Overcome" is about overcoming adversity. And so anybody can relate to that. And it is actually, its roots are in a Negro spiritual from days of slavery, and they just kind of retooled it to fit civil rights movement. And it started out with them singing it in jails when they'd get arrested, and it just spilled out, and so all folk singers, which there were a lot of folk singers, were performing that song, and everybody knew it. If you started singing it, everybody knew it.
Oh. Yeah, there were several, but I don't remember them right offhand.
It was unique because, as I said earlier, we didn't have a lot of contact. I remember when I was in college, I wrestled in college, and the first time I really had a major encounter with an African American is that at a wrestling tournament, I had to wrestle an African American. And I never had any negative feelings toward them, because I never had an encounter. I never had a dealing with them, because Northwest Iowa at that time, at least in rural Northwest Iowa, I grew up on a farm outside of Rock Valley, and we just never saw them. I thought what they were asking for were things that were justifiable, because it was nothing more than the right to vote, the right to go to a restaurant and go in the front door and not the back door, the right to have a bathroom that everybody used and not one that was for blacks and then there was another restroom for whites, or a drinking fountain that was whites and a drinking fountain that was blacks. I didn't think that How can you do that? They're human beings.
Well, I would say disbelief, because I wasn't raised that way. And it was very strange. And I had grandparents who had lived down there, and so they could tell me a lot of what it was like. And I just, it's hard to believe.
Well, I guess I was fortunate when I never saw a black person in person till I was 18. And then when I went to school, it just happened that the few that were on campus were wrestlers, and I took a lot of wrestling classes, and I became okay at wrestling, but because our high school didn't have it, I wasn't good enough to wrestle at the college level. But they were good friends, so I guess I got into people I really liked, so I had a different maybe view than some others. When I went into service, where there was a lot of blacks and different Mexicans and different things, it seemed like the blacks and the Mexicans fought more in the lunch line than the white people did. But I never had problems with race, but I seen a lot of problems.
Today, that concept of like what the Jim Crow laws were of segregation of people on the back of buses being black and the white at the front of the bus being white, today you don't think anything of it, especially, at least I don't think anything of it. I have no problem with African Americans sitting next to me in an athletic contest, or that a family is sitting there, and I think nothing in that aspect, because today I have some nieces and nephews who have been adopted who are African American.
Well, I think we see more diversity, and there's no, people aren't saying, well, get out, you're black. You can date whoever you want to in most cases, though there are always going to be people. There's always going to be people who have a racist view, because it's what they were taught probably from childhood. But I think we see a lot more diversity and more acceptance than we used to.
When I was a kid, it's not my doing, but it was embarrassing, but I remember a family coming through my hometown and stopping to eat at what was called the bowling alley, and the guy wouldn't serve them. The family was black. And I don't see that anymore. I'm sure there's still some things going on, but personally, I don't see them. It was really bad when I was in school. The name calling, the way they were treated was bad.
Remember that there were people that were not real thrilled about this concept of equal rights and so on, because they couldn't see why blacks and whites had a mix. And it was, at this point in time, there were states that had laws that forbid the marriage of blacks and whites. You couldn't have interracial marriages. Children, could not be adopted. Black children could not be adopted by white families. White children could not be adopted by black children, by black families. And those ideas, even though they were kind of quiet, you did hear those type of things here, even in Northwest Iowa.
Well, it was a time of a lot of change and fear, and I think we were all a little scared of some of this stuff, but I think it's important for us now to pay attention to that, because we don't want to repeat it. There's no sense in going backwards. We should keep going forward.
Ernie Middleton was his name. He was a 190-pound wrestler. I took him back to my hometown, and we had more fun because laughing about the looks and the comments and everything from my hometown. My hometown was terrible. When I come back from the service, my aunt said, "How'd you like living with those filthy whatever?" She doesn't have a clue. She'd never been near a black person, but she had this mental image. It was different. So I guess I was fortunate that I hung around good people of different colors.
Even though in today's society we are still segregated by race, if we all work together, someday racism can come to an end.